Well, welcome to this online presentation of the RIN chapter of World Affairs. I'm Bill Bedigovich, and on behalf of Frank Rettenberg, our chairman, and the rest of the members of our committee, welcome you to this presentation. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, we request that you consider becoming a member or donating and gain access to all of our presentations and collection of podcasts. Just go to World Affairs, www.worldaffairs.org to contribute and register. We're very pleased to have with us this afternoon Dr. John Haveman to discuss the impact of President Trump's policies on trade and the trade issue in general. Foreign trade touches all of our lives in many ways, and everyday goods we purchase as consumers to critically important life-saving drugs and equipment. The Trump administration has moved us from multilateral policies to bilateral policies with some serious consequences. In addition, issues and events in this area are fast moving, and it is difficult to keep up with what is taking place. TikTok, Huawei, the World Trade Organization, just to name a few, and there's so much more. To help us make sense of all of this is Dr. John Haveman. He is widely considered one of California's leading experts on international trade policy. His long and productive career includes service on the Federal Trade Commission, senior economist with the President's Council of Economic Advisors, and is a faculty member of the Purdue University Business School. He is a graduate of the University of Wisconsin and received his doctorate in economics from the University of Michigan. John is also the executive director of NEED, National Economic Education Delegation, a unique organization. NEED brings the best and brightest economists together to promote economic policy literacy. All their presentations and PowerPoints are available online, and it is well worth taking a look at and joining this organization. Following this presentation, you'll have a chance to submit written questions to us. So with that, I welcome Dr. Haveman. Thank you for joining us today.
Well, Bill, thanks so much for inviting me to be here. Let me go ahead and share my slides. So, as Bill mentioned, I'm going to be talking about trade issues. There will be a focus on President Trump's trade policies, but I'm going to be a little bit broader than that, and I'll talk some about our experience during the pandemic and some of the policies that countries all over the world have been imposing to either expand or contract trade as they respond to the pandemic. I want to start off by elaborating. Bill, thank you for mentioning NEED and our mission. We are a nonpartisan nonprofit, and as Bill mentioned, our intention is to try and educate the electorate, and that means going out and giving talks to people in as many places as we can. Yesterday, we gave a couple of talks in a high school. This morning, I gave a talk to a Rotary Club. Now I'm giving a talk to you all. We speak to all groups. If you are a member of a group that brings in speakers, I would welcome hearing from you. So the motivation for NEED, and I founded NEED almost 3 years ago now, came out of my frustration as a professional economist. My frustration with politicians who seem to use economics as a weapon for their own personal agenda rather than as a tool for social good. And I figured they get away with that because the electorate doesn't know very much about economic policy, which is a slam on the economics profession and not on the electorate. We, the economics profession, have been shirking a responsibility for a very long time. We know a ton about economic policy issues. We just don't tell anybody, and NEED is an effort to try and change that, again, in a very nonpartisan, fact-based way. I've gotten a lot of support from the economics profession. NEED has an honorary board with 52 members, notably including the two previous chairs of the Federal Reserve, Janet Yellen and Ben Bernanke, and 6 former chairs of the Council of Economic Advisors. The chairs are annotated with a D and an R here to indicate the political party of the president under who they served. and got 3 Nobel Prize winners. Also very pleased that there are 520 members of the profession, all PhD economists, largely academics, who have joined the delegation and are helping to write slide decks for need on different topics and go out and give talks. We have some global partners, 45 or so economists all over the world, a couple in England and Italy who would need to come there and solve their problems once we fix the United States. I tell them it might be a little while because this is a bit of a heavy lift. But anyway, here are the set of topics that we currently have slide decks on. And when any delegate goes out to speak on climate change or economic inequality, all the delegates use the same slide deck. We're all speaking from the same page, and our slide decks are reviewed by a conservative and a liberal subject matter expert. And only what they agree on goes into the deck. So I have a standard joke that the decks that we're now through and we can go to the Q&A because nobody agrees on anything, but that's not true. We actually agree as a profession on an enormous amount. It really is when it comes to talking about policy prescriptions that we tend to differ. Economics doesn't always give you the answer. Sometimes it's your morals, values, and ethics that take you to the right policy prescription for things like economic inequality, per se, or federal debt sometimes. So if you're a member of an organization that brings in speakers, you'd like a speaker to come in on one of these topics, I'll set you up with somebody. Okay, that's enough about need. Let's go on. What am I going to talk about today? Well, I'm not going to talk about all of these issues. I've just listed here some of the trade issues of today, and there are a lot of them. I've got about 35 minutes to speak here, so I'll cover some in depth. I'll talk mostly about US trade policy recently. I'll talk some about the pandemic, and then I'll talk a little bit about the World Trade Organization, which has been really important for international trade, but is in somewhat jeopardy. First, I do want to talk a little bit about rising protectionism. So this is a graph of trade liberalization. The yellow line here, that's trade liberalization amongst advanced economies. And this is declines in the tariffs that they impose on goods. And you can see that those declines stopped right around the global financial crisis. And we've even seen an uptick of late. And here, the blue line, this is on the left-hand axis, the blue line is declines in tariffs in emerging economies or developing economies. And you can see that the rate of decline in tariffs has slowed significantly. There's been a move away from trade liberalization. In fact, if you look just at the G20, arguably the 20 largest developed countries, here we've got the percentage, the line here is the percentage of G20 imports that are subject to a tariff. And this was back around the time of the global financial crisis a decade ago, down less than 2%. And it has since increased to over 10%. Right? If we look at import restrictions in force, this is just the number of import restrictions. We can see that they have increased rather dramatically. Now, I wish I could tell you the proportion of this increase in 2017, that's because of Donald Trump. I think a big part of it is because of US trade policy, but it's also other developed countries that are imposing barriers to trade. So we're entering into a protectionist era, and I do worry that the effects of the pandemic and the activities that countries have been undertaking during the pandemic will lead to more animosity between countries and probably an era where trade liberalization stops or slows dramatically more than it has, and where, in fact, trade protection comes to rule the day. I worry about that. We have a history, if you go back to the 1930s and the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, where tariffs can spiral out of control. The Smoot-Hawley tariffs in the US arguably made the Great Depression much worse than it otherwise would have been. So let's now turn to what's going on in the world. It's basically growing uncertainty. In so many different ways. That whole list that I showed you about 3 slides ago, everything in there contributes to uncertainty. I want to talk about 3 things in particular. Again, US trade policy, what's going on during the pandemic, and what's happening to the World Trade Organization, or the WTO. All right, so let's turn to US trade policy. What has US trade policy been for the last 3.5 years? It's been generally in favor of protectionism. It started off with imposing safeguards Safeguards are protection, in particular industries. In the US, it was solar panels and washing machines, of all things. Safeguards because it was alleged that other countries were selling those products in the United States below cost. And so we needed to impose duties on those goods in order to prevent injury to domestic industries, right? Well, solar panels and washing machines, not very many of those are made in the United States. Right? Solar panels, the effect is to increase the price of solar panels, which means that fewer people are going to be installing solar panels on their roofs, which means that the solar panel installation industry really took it on the chin. And in fact, that's what happened. In a minute, I'll show you a slide that illustrates that a little bit. Washing machines. Washing machines are funny, right? Washing machines are often paired with dryers. In fact, people like the same price relationship between washing machines and dryers. So when tariffs were imposed on washing machines, the effective increase in the price of the combined washing machines and dryers was greater than the size of the tariff, right? So the total price they paid for the package was about 125% of the tariff, right? And that means that there's a lot of benefit or gain that consumers could have gotten from buying washing machines that was taken away from them, taken in tariff revenue to the government, as well to increase profits because the price of dryers went up with no tariff, so increased profits to those who were making dryers both domestically and overseas. The Trump administration then turned to national security issues and increased tariffs on steel and aluminum, and turned to cars and car parts. I don't think those tariffs were ever really implemented because it was illustrated to the Trump administration that would be incredibly damaging to both the car and car parts industries. So we had that trade policy put in, and let's take a look at what happened to the prices of solar panels. Right, so here's a graph that shows residential prices of solar panels. This is in dollars per watt. Right, back in 2015, it was about $3.75 cents per watt, and that was coming down pretty consistently. Little blips here and there, but coming down pretty consistently until the tariffs were imposed. At which point prices jumped up, and they stayed significantly higher than they otherwise would have been. So the consumers ended up paying, $236.5 million more for solar panels than they otherwise would have. And they bought fewer solar panels, and fewer people had solar panel installation jobs, right? So we may have protected the very limited solar panel production industry in the United States, but it came at great cost, as do almost all tariffs. Let me back up a little bit and define a tariff, right? A tariff is simply a tax levied on the import of a good, right? A tariff is paid by the entity doing the importer. So it's paid by the American entity that's bringing the import into the country. And our president made a big deal about how, the Chinese would be paying the tariffs, but that turned out to just not be the case. It was paid entirely by domestic consumers. Beyond these tariffs was the trade war with China, right? There were a couple of different reasons ostensibly for this trade war. The first is the trade deficit, right? The United States has been running a very substantial trade deficit for a long time. I think in 2019, on the good side, it amounted to about $800 billion was the trade deficit. And Donald Trump viewed that as our, giving money to other countries and other countries taking advantage of us. So he wanted to go after the deficit. And our biggest trade deficit, as I'll illustrate in a minute, was with China. So that was part of it as the basis for his starting a trade war with China. Another part of the basis was concerns about Chinese intellectual property practices, the theft outright of technology secrets. And very often when US firms would invest in China into joint ventures, China would mandate that they share their technology with the company that they're engaged in the joint venture with. This is an issue. It's an issue for the United States. It's an issue for Europe. It's an issue for Japan. Which makes it all the more disappointing that we went after China all by ourselves, right? Had we launched a coalition against China, odds are that we could have gotten some benefit out of the deal at much lower cost. as we'll talk about, there's an enormous cost to the trade war that we've been going on, that we've been having with China. The trade war sort of started after the US investigated under Section 301. This is unfair trade practices. It was alleging that there were lots of government subsidies of Chinese goods. The technology transfer mandate was declared an unfair trade practice. So the Federal Trade Commission recommended that we impose tariffs. And so the Trump administration did. Right, since that recommendation in March of 2018 and beginning in about July of 2018, the president has imposed multiple rounds of tariffs on goods coming from China. Here we have, it gives you an idea of the extent of the tariffs that were imposed, right? The first round was on about $34 billion worth of imports from China. The second round on about 16 billion. This again, the second round was on the 23rd of August. And then the third round, the really biggest round of tariffs was on 200 billion, right? So we're getting to most of the imports from China, right? What happens when you impose tariffs on one of your trading partners? Well, more often than not, they tend to impose tariffs back, right? And sure enough, that's what China did. Right, China, we imposed tariffs on 34 billion, so they imposed tariffs on 34 billion. Then we imposed tariffs on 16 billion, they imposed tariffs on 16 billion. We imposed tariffs on 200 billion. Well, they could only, they were running out of US exports to impose tariffs on, so they only had 60 billion in that third round, right? So still, it's most of US exports to China and most of Chinese exports to the United States that are now subject to tariff, right? We can talk a little bit about the magnitude of those tariffs. Here is a graph sort of like the other one, only this is displaying the increase in tariffs, right? So this is the tariff. Before the trade war, US tariffs on Chinese goods were about 3.1% on average, right? And then they went up by 0.2% with the tariffs on solar panels. They went up by less than 0.1% with the tariffs on washing machines. The steel and aluminum tariffs increased them a little bit. And then there's the trade war, right? The trade war increased US tariffs on Chinese goods by an average of 8.5%, all the way up to 12.4%, right? So essentially a tax on our consumption of Chinese goods in the amount of about 12.5%, right? We can look at what China did. China's imports prior to the trade war in 2017 were about 8%. And they put, retaliation for the steel and aluminum tariffs, that's about 0.4%. Then the retaliation in response to our tariffs under the Section 301 was about 11.2%. So their tariffs on our exports are now in the range of about 19.6%. Right? You can imagine that when we put tariffs on the imports of Chinese goods, we import less from them, right? And that should help to reduce our trade deficit, except that when they put tariffs on our exports to them, that reduces our exports. And I've got a graph in a minute that will illustrate the effects that it had on imports from China and exports to China. It did serve to reduce our trade balance with China. This is just looking at goods exports. We could also throw in services exports in here, but they've been largely excluded from the trade war. So here, this is the trade deficit with China. It is clearly the biggest trade deficit that we have with any country. The four bars here for China, this is 2016, 2017, and 2018. Right? So there clearly wasn't a lot of impact on trade in 2018. That's partly because there are contracts that mandated that the trade happened in the second half of 2018, even when the tariffs were in place. But in 2019, those contracts were in place, and so the trade deficit with China did decrease. Right. So then you have to ask the question, has our overall trade deficit decreased? And well, we kind of shifted it over to other countries. So Mexico, our trade deficit with Mexico increased, our trade deficit with Vietnam increased, our trade deficit with Italy and India and Canada, right? And with a wide variety of other countries. So the net effect on our overall trade deficit was pretty small. And honestly, that's not at all surprising because the trade deficit isn't driven primarily by trade in goods. The trade deficit is driven largely in the United States by the federal budget deficit that we have. right? And that's because the federal budget deficit has to be taken care of in some measure by foreign investment into the United States, right? So that's like an export of assets. So if you add together our exports of goods and services and assets, that all equals our imports, and we have balanced trade. If you ignore the assets part of it, then you get a trade deficit, and that's something to worry about, but that's only looking at a part of the picture. Looking at the whole picture, trade is in balance when you include assets. It's the federal budget deficit that's not, and that's what's driving the trade deficit. So it's really, really hard to do anything about the trade deficit unless you work hard on the federal debt, right, and deficit. Well, it's going to be a while before we can work on the federal deficit and debt, so we should probably just stop worrying about the trade deficit for a little while. And I mentioned that I would show the impact on trade with China, right? So back here in 2018-ish, this is when the imports were imposed, and that's 2019. So there was a significant decline in imports from China. This is as a share of US GDP. So we got a drop of about 0.5% of GDP. And you can see that there was also a drop in US exports to China, right? So we may have reduced our trade deficit with China a little bit, but we did it at the expense of reduced exports. We did it at the expense of higher prices for consumers, higher prices for producers, right? The tariffs on steel and aluminum, that didn't do all that much to help the steel and aluminum processing industry in the United States, but it hurt all of the industries. And it's the vast majority of industries in the United States that use steel and aluminum. So the price of their inputs went up. So we may have created jobs in steel and aluminum production, but we have reduced jobs elsewhere in the economy. So it's not, I'm an economist, so I'm legally obligated to remind you that there's no such thing as a free lunch, right? And tariffs may create jobs here, but they will also take jobs away over there. So generally not a good way to increase employment in the economy. Employment is determined by a wide variety of other things that have nothing to do with trade. Also came at the expense of strained trade relations with China for probably a long time to come. That'll play a little bit of a role when we start talking about the impact of the pandemic. There's sort of one final point that I want to make with regard to, if we really do want to reduce our trade deficit, and we think that we can do it by changing trade patterns, is it really China that we want to be looking at, right? So here, this is the US trade deficit this is US imports of goods and services, from other countries as a percent of GDP. The maroon part on top, that's our imports from China. And the blue part down on the bottom, that's imports from everybody else, right? So you can see our imports from China are significant. And judging from the newspaper, even before the trade wars, you would think that that's where we get most of our imports from. But in fact, it's a relatively small part of our imports. So if we're trying to do something about the trade deficit, we need to look more broadly because we're only working on a very thin margin here, right? Our imports from China are considerable, but relative to total imports, they're a relatively small share, right? So again, working on the trade deficit, it's not a matter of working on imports, it's a matter of working on the budget deficit, right? And so the administration has been completely misguided in that regard. That does leave open the question of intellectual property, and have we gotten any gains there? Well, that's entirely unclear. In fact, the administration has started an information technology war with China. We have also imposed export controls. There was a US airplane engine manufacturing company that wanted to send engines to China, but our president in his infinite wisdom decided that was national security concern, so it didn't go. There have been other technology products that have been halted in terms of exports. That's damaging to the US economy. And it's not clear that, and there's TikTok, Huawei. This is part of the information technology war. Now, China is not innocent in all of that. Google has been, and I believe Facebook have both been banned at one point or another from participating in the Chinese market. So that's another trade war that's going on in the background. All very unfortunate, all leads to greater animus. It is clear that China has practices that need to change, but we're not going about it the right way. tariffs might be the right way, but tariffs not only by the United States. If we did it with the European Union and Japan in concert, then that would make up a larger portion of China's export markets, and they would pay greater attention. Now, we do have a phase one deal with China that says that they will import a lot more of our stuff, but we're coming up on a deadline, and it turns out they're going to have to ramp up their imports enormously towards the end of this year to come anywhere close to meeting their obligations under phase one. Now, some of that can be explained by the pandemic, but other of it can be explained by the fact that I think that China was really just going to wait out the election, right? They're waiting out the election. They play the long game. We play the short game. But in the event that the President Trump is not reelected, you can bet that China will assume that President Biden would roll back the tariffs and take us back to the situation we were in before. So they're not going to go all out to meet their phase one goals, betting on Joe Biden winning the presidency. And we'll see in fairly short order. All right, so that's U.S. trade policies. I'll talk a little bit more when I talk about U.S. when I talk about the WTO, and we'll talk a little bit about the effects of the pandemic, on economies and on trade policies. Right, here are some of the effects on economies. They are manifold. They're enormous. I don't want to go through all of these. I'll go through just a couple of them. Let's have a look at reduced GDP. Right, so here's reduced GDP estimates for the world, for advanced economies, for emerging market and developing economies, and for China. Right, so advanced economies taking the biggest hit in Q2 of 2020 and going to be slower returning to normal. Right, China took a smaller hit and is projected to come back much more quickly, as are emerging markets. But this is an enormous hit. Right, about a 15% decline in advanced economies, GDP. That's a big deal. In terms of trade, this is global trade volumes. I lost my pointer. I'm not sure what happened. Well, I've got an arrow. Okay, so this is trade volumes. 2010 equals 100, and they were significantly above that up until the pandemic hit. And now we're down back close to levels that we saw in 2010. So it's a fairly dramatic reduction. In fact, I believe it's the largest reduction in trade in recorded history. We are bouncing back, and it is expected that in a couple of years' time, we'll be back to where we were before, probably a little bit lower, as a lot of firms and countries will emphasize home sourcing as opposed to outsourcing. So the pandemic has probably put a little bit of a dent in global trade, but time will tell how important that turns out to be. I'm going to put up information here on travel. I have completely lost my pointer. That's unfortunate. Right, so here is TSA information on travel from 2019. Here's TSA information on travel from 2020. So you can see how badly travel has tailed off, and travel is very often coincident with trade. So that's part of the explanation. We can look at countries imposing travel bans. The darkest color here is a total border closure. This is somewhat less so. The United States never totally closed its border. Oh, I guess I got my pointer back. I'm not sure what's happening with it. I apologize. Hey, give me just a second. This is unfortunate. Well, I'll go back to my slides, and you'll have to forgive me for their dimmed nature. Technology is a wonderful thing until it doesn't work quite right. I'm not sure how to get rid of that other than to reboot and come back in. Bill, let me know if you think that I should reboot and come back in.
You seem to be working on that slide that you had there. I could see it on screen. You're moving it around.
Yeah,
Yeah,
well,
you
all I
can't see
have
it on
now
this screen,
is a
but
white
on our
screen.
screen.
So I apologize. I'm going to have to reboot and come back in. Huh.
Okay.
I'll be right back.
Meanwhile, I hope that those of you out there who are listening to this marvelous presentation will take the time to come up with some questions that you'd like Dr. Haveman to answer. These great number of issues that are very, very interesting. And I had no idea linking trade to the deficit, which it was totally on it. It's an interesting twist. Of course, our deficit is going to go up and up here as we try to handle the pandemic. So we're waiting for Dr. Haveman to reboot. His system went down in the midst of the presentation. Loss of it should be joining us momentarily, though. And on behalf of the organization and World Affairs, I urge you to go to their website at www.worldaffairs.org and look at all the wonderful online presentations that they have available, along with a number of podcasts that are fascinating to listen to, and they go back quite a few years. So if you could not have attended one of the presentations at either at the San Francisco main office or in some of the chapters, like Marin chapter, you can always listen to podcasts of these marvelous presentations as well. And I think.
Okay, I'm back.
There we are. We're rejoined by you again.
Great to be back. I will share my screen again. Let's see, I think I was about here. All right, and I will put my pointer aside and just use the arrow. Right, so a massive decline in trade. Oh, we did move on to travel and total border closures. And border closures that reduces the movement of people and goods as well. This was at the peak back in May. Since then, most of the borders have loosened up a little bit. Turning to supply chains, I do think that the coronavirus will have a lasting impact on supply chains. That said, I don't think it's going to be very long lasting. In particular, US companies tend to have very short memories. And I could see in 5 years from now, people will sort of put aside the risks associated with being heavily concentrated in a single country. Being concentrated raises revenues, raises profits in the short term, but puts you at greater risk. We can see that when the pandemic started, it was firms with a high China sales exposure that were hit the hardest relative to the S&P. Their stocks did go down more. And we can see over here which industries that are at high risk. The tech sector is at high risk because it's got low inventory and it's got a small number of alternative sources. Industries with higher inventory or higher numbers of sources are at somewhat lower risk. So I do think that supply chains will be affected in the short term. Companies will try to diversify and get their source from more than just one country, so that when one country is affected, they can continue to get source. But again, time and time we've seen U.S. industry not learn from history and make the same mistakes, and I expect that to happen here as well. Okay. Lots of shortages have ensued during the pandemic, including medical related, in particular PPE, medical devices, and other things related to medical. Shortages in a bunch of other things, toilet paper, meat, coins, apparel, lumber. And these shortages have led to a lot of changes in trade policy. To some extent, they've led to reductions in exports and some policies, and in some instances, they have resulted in changes in import policies. So let's take a look at what some of those have been. Right, the effects on export policies. A lot of countries have put export bans on medical supplies and food, making sure that their citizenry gets access to what is needed. Here you can see which countries put temporary export measures in place. Mostly the affected items are PPE and pharmaceutical products, hand sanitizer, of course. You can see the red, that's where the most stringent export restrictions were put on. The green is actually export liberalizations. And these countries with the yellow, those were both export liberalizations and some restrictions. Right, so most of the countries around the world imposed restrictions. And we can see some evidence of that, right? Romania banned grain exports. The US restricted mask and glove exports for 4 months. Borders hardened during the pandemic, right? Other countries look to hold on to their own food. You can see, what are called sickening thy neighbor policies, export restraints on medical equipment. Other headlines, right? Warren and Booker press meat packers to reduce exports to China, vaccine nationalism. There is this race to develop a new vaccine, and a lot of countries worry that if the United States or some company that's heavily influenced by the United States develops the vaccine, then we are going to be selfish with it and not share it. I hope that doesn't turn out to be the case. Right? We can look at which countries imposed sicken thy neighbor policies. At some point this year, 76 nations limited exports of medical supplies. Right, the US is one of those. Most of Europe, China is obviously one of those. Right, and this comes at great cost to countries that were receiving these exports. Right, for the United States, countries like Jamaica received 73% of its imports of regulators and surgical masks from the United States, 93% of their air purifying respirators, and half of their hospital glove imports came from the United States, right? So this imposes significant hardship on these countries. The EU did the same thing, imposing face shields to Cape Verde, 91%, protective garments, 75%, 91% of the gloves that Cape Verde imported came from the EU. So you can imagine the hardship and probably increased loss of life that resulted from these export measures. China, of course, did the same thing, to Kyrgyzstan, 85%, to lots of other countries, protective garments. Ethiopia imported 90% of what it imported from China. So the hardship in these countries, probably very significant. We can focus in a little bit on China, and this is where perhaps all of the negative trade policies that the US has been imposing directed at China for the last couple of years may have come back to bite us in the tush a little bit, because half of our imports of PPE come from China. And Bill and I were talking a little bit about how California put out a contract for $1 billion of imports of PPE from China. And that might have been a lot cheaper if it hadn't been for the Trump trade policy over the course of the last couple of years. And China is a massive exporter to just generally of PPE. Okay. Import policies, there were both import expansion policies, trying to get things that you don't have, did that through tariff reductions, and there were import contraction policies, tariff increases, import bans, and government procurement. A lot of calls during a period like this for the government to buy American or to buy Chinese or to buy German, and that affects trade flows. And again, we can look at some headlines, right? All right. April 20, Trump exempt virus hit U.S. businesses from import tariffs. U.S. tariffs hampered imports of sanitizer and disinfectants. Trump rebuffed demands to lift tariffs as the economy falters. Some tariffs were suspended for 90 days, and on and on. A lot of such headlines, including some that, multinationals fear a rise in protectionism because of the pandemic. So the pandemic has really wreaked an awful lot of havoc on international trade flows. And here we can look at the countries that have temporary import measures. Overall, they've been largely restrictive, but for some countries, the US included, there have been more liberalizations. import restrictions in the Middle East, and both import liberalizations and restrictions in Asia and Australia. Right? With regard to the pandemic, the pandemic has had a devastating effect on the global economy, serious effects on global trade and supply chains. Supply chains, again, I think the impacts there will be more long-lived than on global trade generally. Most adverse effects on trade policies have been mostly adverse in terms of reducing exports and reducing imports when it's all netted out. How much of this is going to be permanent remains to be seen, and I'm very concerned about it. Once trade restrictions go into place, they tend to come off with significant difficulty. Especially at a time where, now I can turn to the World Trade Organization, at a time where the world's leading body for generating trade liberalization is really taking it on the chin, largely from the United States. The World Trade Organization is where multilateral trade negotiations take place, where 100 countries get together and try to jointly reduce trade. A lot of liberalization lately has been on a more limited basis outside of the World Trade Organization through bilateral agreements, that is country-to-country agreements or regional agreements. Along with this predecessor of the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or Trade and Tariffs, which some people call the General Agreement to Talk and Talk, because the rounds of negotiations take a long time, but there's a long history of trade liberalization. I'll show you the results it's had for the US over time. Alone, the WTO has a very good track record of dispute resolution. That should be an of, not an or. I apologize, but there have been recent setbacks. The dispute settlement mechanism, which the United States has used very effective over the years, very effectively gotten other countries to pursue trade policies that are both in our interests and both aligned with our view of appropriate trade policies. We've been very successful, but there's a stable of judges. There's supposed to be a stable of judges. I believe it's supposed to be at least 6 judges, maybe more. And you need 3 judges to adjudicate any one case. But the US has been blocking new appointments to that roster of judges. So I believe it was as of last December, they went down to 2 judges, which means that nothing more can happen than a dispute settlement mechanism. The United States has, on its own, shut down the dispute settlement mechanism. And the US has been talking Washington, D.C., as I understand it, of withdrawing permanently from the World Trade Organization. I think the hope is among those folks that the EU and other countries will follow suit and join us, but there's no indication that they will do so. Certainly our president hasn't built up any relationships that would suggest that other countries would be interested in following our lead in that regard. Here's just a graph on trade liberalization that's resulted from the GATT and the WTO. Right, so the red dash line, that's duty collected as a share of imports that are subject to duties. And this is duties collected as a share of total imports. You can see that when the GATT was established, duties were up here around 25%, and through successive rounds, they're now down around 5%. So a lot of liberalization has come out of that. All right, let me sum up, and then I will take your questions. Global trade, I think it's in a very precarious position. I have been a professional economist for about 30 years now. I was trained in graduate school as an international trade economist. And when I came out of graduate school, it was kind of an exciting time for trade. There's been lots of trade growth over those 30 years, but the last 10 years since the global financial crisis has seen really quite a turnaround in that. And there is so much uncertainty out there, and a lot of it is driven by US trade policy. The U.S. has traditionally been a leader in multilateral liberalization. We've completely abdicated that position. We're now a leader in protectionism. Is anybody going to pick up that mantle? I don't know who. I don't see the EU necessarily doing it. The United States is actively undermining global trade. The pandemic is going to have a widespread effect, and some of those effects are potentially going to be durable on supply chains, and particularly global trust. Right, I showed those tables of exports to PPE or imports of PPE from the United States, from the EU, and from China. Those countries are being kicked in the teeth by the EU, US, and China. So they're going to be, much less friendly to us when we make moves to liberalize trade between our countries. So I think that's going to be a problem going forward as well. All right. And that's what I have. And I am happy to stop sharing my screen or leave the screen up. And Bill, do we have any questions in the Q&A?
Yes, we certainly do have a few questions here, and I want to thank you for this has been an eye-opener for me, and I'm sure for our attendees as well, John. You really pointed out a lot of consequences and a lot of issues that some of which were certainly unknown to me before. And in that regard, we have a couple additional questions here because the first two that were really describing the budget deficit and the trade deficit and the commonalities there. But another question came in from Louis Stalinsky, who said, at the first half hour, your talk seems to be a strong indictment of Trump's economic policy. How do you judge the economic policy of the Obama and Bush administrations? I don't know if that's too political for you.
Well, so I judge them as being too little, not progressive enough in terms of seeking liberalization. But neither one had a trade agenda that was even in the same universe as is being pursued by the Trump administration. These tariffs are being put in place ostensibly to help people. They're doing, in fact, exactly the opposite. And there's some literature out there that even shows that imposing tariffs is regressive, which means that it hurts those who are low income more than those who are high income. So it was intended to be a little bit of an indictment of the Trump trade policies, because they have been completely ineffective, either achieving their goals vis-a-vis China and the trade deficit, or in terms of improving the lives of Americans.
One question came in and said, in terms of looking at a new possibility of a new president, and if Biden comes in there, what would you expect? What kind of changes do you think he might bring to this program?
I would expect to see a rollback of, the parallels to what Trump did to Obama's policies. I expect to see enormous rollbacks of Trump's policies by the Biden administration. The tariffs are at the president's discretion, clearly, so they will go away. I would anticipate on day one, day 2 or 3, that President Biden would eliminate those tariffs. I don't expect a truly progressive trade liberalization agenda out of the Biden administration. I would expect that, other than undoing the trade war with China, trade will probably take a back seat to a great many other, perhaps more pressing domestic policy issues.
And Cohen asked, in the past, China bought a lot of our treasury bonds, our debt. Do they still do so? Or what's the prognosis?
Well, our debt held by foreign countries has gone down. They still own an enormous amount, about $1 trillion worth of U.S. debt, which is only about 5% of our total debt at this point. So Japan and China are the two biggest holders of U.S. debt, each at somewhere around $1 trillion. I think Japan overtook China recently. I don't know that they're buying in the quantities that they historically have. I think both countries are buying a little bit less during the pandemic. But it hasn't been a change in policy stance on behalf of the Chinese.
And then Frank asks, do we need to review our visa policy to permit talented foreigners, particularly those skilled in technology, to enter the United States without a hassle, even if they're from, say, Muslim countries?
Yeah, so NEED has a very nice slide deck on immigration policy. And I think that most of what's in that slide deck points out to the notion that, yes, we should liberalize our immigration laws. There are myths surrounding immigration that just aren't true in terms of crime, in terms of hurting low-wage U.S. workers. Those are sometimes the hurting low-wage workers. That's sometimes true, but not as a general principle. It's starting to turn out, and our population is growing very slowly. And if we want to grow our economy, we're going to need population growth, and there's nowhere we're going to get it other than through immigration. The economics point in favor of expanding immigration, if not only because that would help shore up Social Security, right? Social Security is paid for in each year by those who are working. And as those who are retired become greater in number relative to those who are working, Social Security gets into a deeper and deeper hole.
And our last question is from Betty Guthrie, who says, what is the impact of interest payments on federal debt on trade and trade balance?
I think that was the first question.
Was probably what, okay.
I think we did address that one.
All right then. Well, with that, John, that concludes our questions from our audience, and I'd like to thank you again for this tremendous presentation. It was really enlightening, and we look forward to seeing you again sometime in the future.
Well, thank you, Bill, for inviting me. It was a pleasure, and I will be delighted to come back. I hope that I'm glad that you enjoyed it, and I hope that everybody else in the audience did as well. Thanks so much. And if you'd like a talk on economics, please reach out to Need. We'll be happy to provide one.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. And good night to all of you.